The first time I saw it, I thought it was a child. That's what any rational person would think. A small figure crouched by the creek bed in the pre-dawn light, its silhouette barely visible through the morning mist that clung to the Douglas firs like breath. I was checking my trail cameras, part of my routine work as a wildlife biologist for the Olympic National Forest. The motion sensors had triggered at 4:47 a.m., which wasn't unusual. Elk moved through this drainage regularly, and occasionally a black bear would fish the shallow waters for cutthroat trout. But this wasn't an elk, and it certainly wasn't a bear. I watched the footage 3 times that morning in my cabin, my coffee growing cold in my hand. The figure was small, perhaps 3.5 feet tall, with proportions that seemed simultaneously childlike and profoundly wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head slightly too large for the body. It moved with a curious, deliberate quality, as if every gesture required conscious thought. For 17 seconds, it remained motionless at the water's edge. Then it turned, and for just a fraction of a moment, its face caught the infrared light. I should have reported it immediately. That's protocol for any anomalous sighting in federal wilderness. But something stopped me, a feeling I can only describe as witnessing something sacred, something that existed in a space between classification and mystery. The eyes, even through the grainy footage, held an intelligence that made my skin prickle with recognition and fear in equal measure. I named the location Creekside Alpha in my field notes. I told no one. That was February 14th, 2019. For the next 6 months, I would return to that creek bed again and again, slowly assembling the most comprehensive documentation of something that should not exist, something that would cost me my career, my reputation, and very nearly my freedom. This is not a story about alien invasion or cosmic terror. This is a story about what happens when a scientist discovers something extraordinary and faces an impossible choice: reveal the truth and destroy it, or protect it through silence. Some discoveries are not meant to be shared. Some knowledge carries a weight heavier than ignorance. I learned that lesson in the worst possible way. My daily routine had been unchanged for 3 years. Wake at 5 a.m., brew coffee from the propane stove, check weather data, review overnight camera footage, then head into the field by 6:30. The Olympic Peninsula in winter is a study in gray sky, gray rain, gray fog that transforms the old-growth forest into something primordial and eternal. I monitored a grid of 36 trail cameras across a 12-square-mile section of wilderness, tracking cougar populations, elk migration patterns, and the slow recovery of wolf territories. I was good at my job precisely because I was methodical, skeptical, and patient. I had a PhD in wildlife ecology from UC Davis. I had published papers on predator-prey dynamics in peer-reviewed journals. I was not the kind of person who saw things that weren't there, but the figure at Creekside Alpha was there, and it kept coming back. By February 20th, I had captured it on camera 4 more times, always between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., always alone, always engaged in activities that suggested intelligence, examining stones, manipulating small objects, once appearing to arrange twigs in a careful pattern that I later photographed from multiple angles. The infrared footage was frustratingly unclear, but each sighting added details to my growing understanding. The skin, or what I could see of it, appeared gray or pale brown, with a texture that seemed smooth rather than hairy. The eyes were disproportionately large, catching the camera's infrared with a reflective quality similar to nocturnal animals but more pronounced. The hands had 4 fingers, each longer and more delicate than human fingers, moving with a precision that reminded me of a watchmaker or a surgeon. I began leaving offerings. This violated every principle of wildlife observation: never interact, never influence, never anthropomorphize. But this wasn't wildlife observation anymore. This was something else entirely. On February 25th, I left a small mirror propped against a rock near the water's edge. The next morning, the footage showed the figure approaching cautiously, spending nearly 4 minutes examining its reflection. The head tilted at angles that seemed anatomically wrong for a human neck. Then it picked up the mirror and carried it away, moving with a gait that was almost but not quite bipedal, a strange gliding motion that suggested different evolutionary pressures than our own. I upgraded my equipment. I invested $3,000 of my own money in a high-resolution thermal camera with a narrow beam recorder that could capture audio. I built a camouflaged blind 30 yards from the creek, positioned downwind, lined with scent-blocking material. I told my supervisor I was tracking a particularly elusive cougar and needed to spend more time in the field. He approved without question. I had always been reliable, always delivered solid data. The guilt was beginning to build even then. Every day I didn't report this was another day of professional dishonesty. But what would I report? I found something that might be extraterrestrial. The ridicule would be instant and permanent. My career would end not with a whimper, but with laughter. So I continued alone. By March I had established a pattern. The figure appeared roughly every third night, always during the darkest hours, always in the same general area within a 100-yard radius of the creek. It seemed to be collecting something. I found evidence of digging in several locations, small holes approximately 6 inches deep, always near the roots of red cedar trees. I took soil samples, found nothing unusual. Elevated levels of certain rare earth elements, but within normal range for Pacific Northwest geology. The behavior suggested purpose. This wasn't random wandering. This was methodical activity, perhaps scientific in nature. The thought sent electricity through my mind. What if this being was also a researcher? What if we were mirror images, each studying the other's world from the shadows? On March 15th, I finally captured clear audio. The sound was unlike anything in my database of wilderness vocalizations, a series of soft clicks and whistles, almost melodic, with harmonic overtones that suggested language or at least complex communication. I ran the audio through spectrographic analysis. The frequency range extended both below and above normal human hearing. Some of the sounds were ultrasonic. This was not mimicry. This was not human. I began sleeping in the blind, wrapped in a cold weather bag, my breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The isolation was profound. The forest at night is never silent. There's always the drip of condensation, the rustle of small mammals, the distant call of owls. But there's a quality of aloneness that becomes almost tangible, a presence that presses against your consciousness. On March 22nd at 4:33 a.m., I saw it with my own eyes for the first time. Not through a camera, not through a lens. Just me, sitting in the darkness, and the figure emerging from the tree line like a materialization of shadow given form. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might give me away. Every instinct screamed to move, to run, to call out. I did none of those things. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing, watching as it approached the creek with that strange, deliberate gait. It was smaller than I had estimated, more fragile. In the ambient starlight, I could see the thinness of the limbs, the delicate structure that suggested a different gravity or a different evolutionary path. It knelt by the water, actually knelt, a gesture so human it made my throat tighten, and appeared to be washing something in the current. For 11 minutes I watched. Then it stood, turned, and looked directly at where I was hidden. I stopped breathing. We stared at each other across 30 yards of darkness. I could not see its expression, but I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure. Then slowly, it raised one hand, a gesture that could have been warning or acknowledgement or something beyond my capacity to interpret, and disappeared back into the forest with a silence that should have been impossible for anything that size. I did not move for another hour. When I finally emerged from the blind, my legs were numb and my mind was racing with a single, inescapable conclusion. It knew I was there. It had always known. And it had allowed me to watch. The ethical implications consumed me. I stopped sleeping properly, existing in a fugue state between exhaustion and hyper-awareness. My supervisor noticed. "You look like hell, Carter," he said during our weekly check-in. "You need to take a few days off. Go into Port Angeles, see some people, remember what civilization looks like." I assured him I was fine. I was not fine. By April, I had accumulated over 60 hours of footage. I had photographs, audio recordings, soil samples, and detailed field notes that read like science fiction. I had documented behaviors that suggested tool use, social signaling, and possibly even artistic expression. I found small arrangements of colored stones that served no apparent survival function but displayed clear intentionality in their composition. But I had no one to share this with, no colleague I could trust, no framework for understanding what I had found. The figure, I had stopped calling it in my private thoughts, though I had no idea of gender, or even if gender was a relevant concept, continued its nocturnal routines. I began to recognize individual patterns, the way it would pause and tilt its head before moving to a new location, the preference for certain types of stones, smooth river rock, particularly those with crystalline inclusions, the apparent ritual of touching specific trees before departing. On April 8th, I made a decision that would change everything. I left a notebook and a pencil at the creek site. It was anthropocentric, presumptuous, and possibly dangerous. I knew all of that, but the scientist in me needed to know. Could it recognize tools? Could it understand symbolic representation? The notebook was blank except for a simple drawing I had made on the first page. A stick figure human, a stick figure of the being, and a question mark between them. The next morning, the notebook was gone. For 3 days, nothing happened. I began to question my own judgment. Had I crossed a line? Had I frightened it away permanently? The cameras showed no activity. The creek site remained empty. I felt a loss that surprised me with its intensity. Not the loss of a research subject, but something more personal, as if I had damaged a fragile trust. Then, on April 12th, the notebook reappeared. I found it propped carefully against the same rock where I had left the mirror weeks earlier. My hands shook as I opened it. The stick figures had been modified. Where I had drawn simple circles for heads, there were now more detailed renderings. My figure showed eyes, nose, mouth in crude but recognizable proportion. The other figure showed eyes that were much larger, no visible nose, and what might have been a mouth or simply a line. And below the drawings, filling half the page, was text. Not English. Not any language I recognized. The characters were geometric, precise, composed of combinations of straight lines and perfect circles that suggested mathematical thinking. But there was rhythm to it, a visual pattern that implied syntax and grammar. It was beautiful and utterly alien. I stood in the forest holding that notebook, and I wept. Not from fear, from awe. From the devastating recognition that I was holding proof of non-human intelligence, and I could never show it to anyone without triggering consequences I couldn't control or predict. That night I wrote a response. I drew pictures. The solar system with Earth highlighted. A tree, the creek, a simple equation. 2 + 2 = 4. Musical notes. I left the notebook again, this time with a small LED lantern that could be turned on and off. A gift, a tool, a test. The correspondence continued. Every few days, new additions would appear in the notebook. Simple diagrams at first, then more complex representations. I learned that the being understood mathematics. It corrected an error I had deliberately included in a geometric proof. It understood representation. It drew what I eventually recognized as a map of the local area, with the creek site marked by a specific symbol that it repeated each time. But more than information, we were sharing something else. Acknowledgement. Mutual recognition of consciousness. I would draw a spiral. It would draw a different spiral. I would sketch a constellation. It would add stars I had missed. We were dancing around the edges of communication, two minds trying to bridge an impossible gap. On May 1st, I found something new in the notebook, a drawing of what appeared to be a craft or structure, definitely artificial, composed of curves and symmetries that suggested technology, and next to it a drawing of multiple figures, all similar to my mysterious correspondent. Not alone then. Never alone. The implications were staggering. If there was one, there were more. If there were more, there was a reason they were here. If they were here in Olympic National Forest, how many other remote locations around the world hosted similar hidden populations? I began to research. Late at night in my cabin, using satellite internet that was frustratingly slow, I searched for similar reports. There were thousands, dismissed as hoaxes, hallucinations, misidentifications, but buried in the noise were consistent patterns. Small figures, nocturnal activity, proximity to water sources, preference for old-growth forests, non-aggressive behavior. We weren't the only ones looking at the stars, wondering if we were alone. We had visitors, or perhaps refugees, or perhaps something else entirely. Scientists, observers, beings who had chosen Earth's remote places to exist quietly, studying us as I was studying them. On May 15th, I made my second critical mistake. I sent an encrypted email to a colleague I trusted, a xenobiologist at SETI whom I had known since graduate school. I didn't send footage. I didn't send coordinates. I just asked a hypothetical question. If someone were to document non-human intelligence in a terrestrial setting, what would be the proper protocol for reporting without triggering immediate military intervention? She responded within 6 hours. Carter, what the hell have you found? I never got to answer, because 3 days later, they arrived. May 18th, 2019. The morning started normally. Routine camera checks, coffee, the familiar weight of the thermal recorder in my pack. I had left another entry in the notebook the night before, a drawing of molecular structures with a question mark, hoping to understand something about the being's biology or origins. I reached Creekside Alpha at 6:15 a.m. The notebook was there, but something was wrong. The pages were disturbed, torn slightly as if handled roughly or in haste. The new entry was minimal, a single symbol that looked like a warning sign, repeated 3 times with increasing urgency in the rendering. And beneath it something that made my blood run cold, a drawing of multiple human figures surrounding a single smaller figure. The message was clear. They knew they were being watched. Not by me, by someone else. I heard the vehicles before I saw them. The sound of heavy tires on the Forest Service road, a route that was supposed to be closed except to authorized personnel. I moved quickly, instinct overriding thought, and concealed myself in a thicket of salal approximately 50 yards from the creek. Through the dense foliage, I watched as 3 black SUVs emerged from the tree line and parked in formation. The men who emerged wore dark suits that were absurdly out of place in the wilderness. Polished shoes, sunglasses despite the overcast sky, the kind of anonymous professionalism that screamed federal agency. But their badges were wrong. FBI agents don't travel in teams of 9. Park Service officers don't carry that kind of sidearm. These were contractors, private security, or something else operating under a veneer of official authority. A woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled back severely, appeared to be in command. She surveyed the area with the efficiency of someone executing a familiar protocol. "Secure the perimeter," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Full sweep, 30-meter radius. Collect all equipment, all materials. I want documentation, soil samples, and a complete photographic record." They found my blind immediately. The lead contractor called out, "Thermal camera, high-end civilian model, fresh batteries, recorder with external mic, this is professional work." "Bag it all," the woman said, "run the serial numbers." I watched them work with military precision. They found the notebook. One of the men held it up and the woman examined it briefly before placing it in a black case with biohazard symbols. They found my other cameras, my measuring equipment, even the small cache of supplies I had hidden for overnight stays. They were erasing 6 months of work in less than 30 minutes, but they hadn't found me. And more importantly, they hadn't found what I had come to think of as my colleague, the being that had trusted me enough to communicate, to share its existence across the unbridgeable gap between our kinds. Then I saw movement at the tree line. It was there, standing partially concealed behind a massive cedar, approximately 40 yards from where the team was working. In full daylight, I could see details that the cameras had never captured. The texture of skin that seemed to shimmer slightly, as if refracting light in ways that weren't quite natural. The large, dark eyes that dominated the face. The way it stood, perfectly still, watching the intrusion with what I could only interpret as profound sadness. One of the contractors turned suddenly. "Movement," he said sharply, hand going to his weapon. 10 o'clock. Tree line. The team responded instantly, forming a tactical formation. The woman raised binoculars. For a long moment she observed in silence. Then she lowered them slowly and said something I will never forget. "Stand down. We're not here for contact. We're here for containment. Ma'am, I have a clear visual on. I know what you see. Follow protocol. We document. We sanitize. We withdraw. That's the mission." She turned to address the entire team. "Listen carefully. What you observe here does not leave this site. This is a level 5 containment situation under the Breckenridge Protocol. You do not speak about this to anyone. Not your colleagues, not your families, not your therapists. The penalties for disclosure are spelled out in your contracts, are we clear?" A chorus of acknowledgments. The being at the tree line hadn't moved. It was watching them, and I realized with a chill that it was also watching me. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw recognition. It knew I was there. It had known all along. The woman made a call on a satellite phone. "This is Team Leader Valdez. Creekside Alpha is hot. Evidence of extended observation period. Civilian researcher. Category 3 contact indicators. Recommend full memory suppression protocol for primary subject and continued monitoring of the site. No, we have not achieved direct contact." "Yes, ma'am, the subject appears aware of our presence and is maintaining distance." She listened for a long moment. "Understood. We'll leave passive surveillance and withdraw. Estimated local population?" She paused. Unknown, but based on artifact distribution, we're looking at 3 to 5 individuals within a 10-kilometer radius. 3 to 5. There were more. A small community, hidden in one of the last truly wild places in the continental United States. And the government, or some branch of it that operated in shadows, knew about them. Had known for how long? Years? Decades? The woman ended her call and turned to her team. "Pack it up. We're done here." As they prepared to leave, she walked to the edge of the creek and stood there for a moment, looking directly at where the being had been standing. It was gone now, vanished with that impossible silence. She spoke softly, possibly to herself, possibly to the forest. "I'm sorry." Then they were in their vehicles and driving away, leaving only disturbed earth and the absence of my equipment to mark their presence. I remained hidden for another 2 hours, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. This wasn't first contact. This was ongoing management of a situation that existed in the classified spaces between official reality and suppressed truth. When I finally emerged, I found one item they had missed. A single page from the notebook, caught in the undergrowth near the creek. On it was the drawing of the multiple human figures surrounding the smaller figure, and beneath it, a new addition made in what looked like haste, a simple symbol that could have been a door or a mouth or a warning. Silence. The message was clear. Survival depended on silence. I should have walked away. Any rational person would have recognized the warning for what it was. A line drawn by forces with resources and authority, far beyond my capacity to resist. My equipment was gone. My documentation was confiscated. The message was unambiguous. Forget what you saw. Resume your normal life. Consider yourself lucky to avoid prosecution. But I couldn't forget. And more than that, I couldn't abandon the being that had trusted me. The next 3 days were spent in my cabin, running on adrenaline and very little sleep, trying to reconstruct everything from memory. I had some backup files on an external hard drive that I kept hidden. Not the best footage, but enough. I had field notes written in a personal shorthand that would mean nothing to anyone else. I had the single page from the notebook, which I photographed from every angle, and then burned, scattering the ashes in the wood stove. I began to understand what I was dealing with. The operation at Creekside Alpha had been too smooth, too rehearsed. This wasn't their first time. The Breckenridge Protocol the woman had mentioned. I searched for it using VPN connections and found nothing. It didn't exist in any public record, which meant it was deeply classified. But I found other things. Scattered references in FOIA requests that had been heavily redacted. A congressional hearing from 1978 where a senator asked about management of non-conventional biological entities on federal land, and was told the session would need to continue in closed proceedings. A research paper from a defense contractor about containment strategies for low-density cryptid populations that had been published briefly and then scrubbed from the internet, but archived by someone on an obscure forum. A pattern emerged. For at least 40 years, possibly longer, some branch of the government had been aware of these beings and had actively worked to suppress knowledge of their existence, not through force, but through containment, observation, and the careful management of information. The question that consumed me was why? Why not disclose? Why not study them openly? The implications were staggering. Proof that Earth hosted non-human intelligence, possibly extraterrestrial in origin, beings that could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness, evolution, biology, everything. But then I thought about what would happen if the truth came out. The media frenzy, the religious implications, the conspiracy theories, the amateur hunters flooding into wilderness areas, the military interest, the corporate interest, the complete destruction of whatever fragile piece these beings had found in their hidden existence. Disclosure would mean extinction. Silence meant survival. Theirs, and in a different way, mine. On May 22nd, I received a visit at my cabin. A man in his 40s wearing jeans and a fleece jacket that looked authentically outdoorsy but probably cost more than my truck. He introduced himself as Dr. James Patterson from the Department of the Interior's Office of Ecological Integrity. The office didn't exist. I checked later. "Dr. Carter," he said, settling into the chair I offered, with the ease of someone comfortable with difficult conversations. "I understand you've had some equipment stolen from one of your research sites. I want you to know that we take theft from federal researchers very seriously. We've opened an investigation." "That's very thorough of you," I said carefully. "We've also noticed some irregularities in your field reports over the past few months." extended periods at a single site, unusual equipment purchases, a change in your standard research protocols. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Nothing concerning, of course, just unusual. I was tracking what I believed to be an individual cougar with particularly interesting territorial behavior, I said, using the cover story I had prepared. The data didn't support the hypothesis, so I didn't include it in my reports. Standard research process. Of course, he nodded, pulling out a tablet. I'd love to see whatever data you did collect. Even negative results can be valuable. The equipment that was stolen contained most of it. I have some backups, but they're fragmentary. Nothing conclusive. He studied me for a long moment. Dr. Carter, I'm going to be direct with you. You're a good researcher. You have a solid reputation, a promising career. It would be a shame if burnout or stress led you to make decisions that complicated that career. Remote wilderness work can be isolating. Sometimes people see things, interpret patterns that aren't really there. It's understandable. Human. Are you suggesting I'm having psychological issues? I'm suggesting that if you were experiencing stress, there are resources available. Paid leave, counseling, a reassignment to a less isolated posting. He leaned forward slightly. I'm also suggesting that sometimes the most professional choice is to recognize when a line of investigation isn't productive and to move on to other work. The threat was velvet-covered but unmistakable. Comply or face professional destruction through psychiatric evaluation and forced leave. I appreciate your concern, I said, but I'm fine, and I'm looking forward to continuing my work here. Even without your equipment? The Forest Service has excellent loaner gear I'll manage. He stood, straightening his jacket. I'm glad to hear it. I'll be in touch about the theft investigation. In the meantime, if you find any unusual data from your previous work, I hope you'll share it with my office. We have specialists who can help interpret anomalous findings. After he left, I sat in my cabin for a long time, watching the rain begin to fall through the window. The message was clear. They knew I had more than I was saying, but they weren't sure how much. They were giving me a chance to comply voluntarily before escalating to more aggressive measures. That night I made my decision. I would continue my work, but differently. No more cameras at the creek site. No more obvious observation. If they were watching me, and they certainly were, I would give them nothing to see. But I would maintain the communication. I would protect the being and its small community. Because someone had to bear witness to their existence even if that witness could never speak publicly about what he had seen. The next morning I returned to Creekside Alpha on foot, taking a circuitous route through difficult terrain where I was unlikely to be followed. I found a new spot, carefully concealed, and left a simple message scratched into the bark of a fallen log. I'm sorry. I'm still here. You're not alone. I didn't know if the message would be found or understood, but I had to try, because in the end that's what separates us from the silence. The choice to reach across the darkness and say, I see you. You matter. Your existence is worth protecting. Even if that protection cost me everything. For 3 weeks, I saw nothing. The creek site remained empty, at least during the limited hours I could observe without drawing attention. I continued my official duties, monitoring my regular camera grid, filing reports on elk populations and predator movements, playing the role of the diligent researcher who had simply experienced an unfortunate theft, but I could feel the surveillance. Nothing I could point to specifically. No obvious followers, no strange vehicles. Just a sense of being observed that became a constant background hum in my awareness. My emails were probably monitored. My phone calls certainly were. Even my movements in the forest might be tracked through satellite or drone technology I couldn't detect. On June 10th, everything changed. I was conducting a routine camera check 3 miles from Creekside Alpha when I noticed something odd. Scratch marks on a Douglas fir that were fresh, deep, and followed a pattern I had seen before. 4 parallel gouges, evenly spaced, too precise to be from claws. The being had marked this tree, leaving a sign I was meant to recognize. At the base of the tree, carefully concealed beneath moss and forest duff, I found a small object wrapped in leaves. My hands shook as I uncovered it. A smooth river stone with symbols carved into its surface. The same geometric characters I had seen in the notebook. But this was permanent, painstaking work that must have taken hours with primitive tools. The message was clear. The communication would continue, but in a way that couldn't be confiscated or traced. Over the next 2 weeks, I found 7 more stones, each at a different location, each containing what appeared to be a fragment of a larger message. I documented them photographically, then returned them exactly as I found them, conscious that removing them might break trust or leave evidence of my involvement. The symbols began to resolve into meaning, not words exactly, but concepts expressed through visual mathematics. I spent my evenings decoding them, filling notebooks with translations and interpretations. What emerged was a story. They had come from elsewhere. How far or how long ago wasn't clear, but the symbols suggested distances that made my mind reel. They were few in number, survivors of something that might have been an accident or might have been intentional exile. Earth offered what they needed: relative safety, biological compatibility, and the possibility of existing unnoticed in the spaces humans had abandoned or never fully explored. They had been here for generations, their generations, which might be longer or shorter than ours. They avoided contact not from fear of humans specifically, but from the knowledge that discovery meant change, and change meant death. Not violent death necessarily, but the death of anonymity, the end of the quiet existence they had built in the margins of human civilization. The most devastating revelation came in the eighth stone. They were dying, not from disease or violence, but from simple demographics. They were too few, too isolated, their genetic diversity insufficient for long-term survival. Within what I estimated to be 50 to 100 years, this pocket of non-human intelligence would simply fade away, leaving no trace except possibly fossils that would baffle future paleontologists. They knew this. The symbols expressed not despair exactly, but a kind of melancholic acceptance. They had extended their existence as long as possible, but evolution and mathematics were inexorable. The end was coming slowly, generation by generation, and there was nothing to be done, unless there were others. Other populations equally hidden, equally fragile. The symbols posed this as a question. Were they the last, or were there more, scattered across Earth's remote places, each believing themselves alone? I sat in my cabin that night, rain drumming on the roof, and confronted the impossible weight of what I had learned. I possessed knowledge that could potentially save an intelligent species from extinction, if other populations existed, if contact could be established, if genetic exchange was possible. But using that knowledge required disclosure, and disclosure would trigger exactly the kind of attention that had driven them into hiding in the first place. The Breckenridge Protocol made sense now in its cruel pragmatism. Contain, monitor, but do not interfere. Let them fade away naturally. Document their existence for classified archives, but never allow the public disruption that active conservation would require. It was genocide through inaction, wrapped in the language of minimal interference and respect for autonomy. On June 29th, I found the ninth stone. The message was simple and devastating. Help, one word, or the equivalent of one word in their geometric language, but it contained multitudes. It was an acknowledgement that their isolation was killing them. It was a request that contradicted their own survival strategy. It was trust placed in a human who had shown compassion, but who was also powerless to provide what they needed. I carried that stone with me for 3 days, unable to return it, unable to decide. Every option led to catastrophe. If I disclosed publicly, I would trigger a media frenzy that would destroy them and my credibility. If I went through official channels, I would simply alert the same forces that were already suppressing their existence. If I did nothing, I would be complicit in their slow extinction. On July the 2nd, I made my decision. I would not save them, I couldn't, but I could honor their existence by becoming a guardian of their memory. I would document everything, not for immediate publication, but for the future. A time capsule of knowledge sealed and hidden, to be discovered only when humanity might be ready to handle the truth with wisdom, rather than exploitation. I began that work immediately. Detailed descriptions of every encounter, translations of the symbols, photographs of the stones taken from angles that revealed their craftsmanship, a complete account of the Breckenridge Protocol and the government's involvement. Everything that would be needed to prove that we had not been alone, that intelligence had worn other faces, and that we had chosen silence over salvation. I returned the ninth stone to where I had found it, and beside it, I placed a response carved into a flat piece of slate I had worked on for hours, a symbol that combined their character for understanding with my approximation of gratitude, and beneath it, a simple representation, 2 figures, standing side by side, under a shared sky. It was the best I could offer, not help, but witness, not salvation, but acknowledgement. You existed, you mattered, You were not forgotten. Even if the world never knew, I would remember. The consequences arrived with bureaucratic inevitability. On July 15th, I was summoned to the regional office in Seattle for what was described as a routine performance review. I knew immediately it was anything but routine. My supervisor, Dave Morrison, a man I had worked with for 3 years and respected deeply, couldn't meet my eyes when I arrived. The review board consisted of 3 people I had never met, 2 administrators from Washington, D.C., and a woman who introduced herself only as Ms. Valdez, the same woman who had led the team at Creekside Alpha. Dr. Carter, the lead administrator began, shuffling papers that I suspected were mostly for show. We've been reviewing your work over the past 6 months, and we have some concerns about your methodology, your deviation from approved research protocols, and certain irregularities in your reporting. I said nothing, waiting. Your camera placements have been erratic, he continued. You've spent an inordinate amount of time in a single location with minimal documented justification. You've made equipment purchases outside normal channels, and you've been observed engaging in behavior that suggests you may be under significant stress. What behavior specifically? Ms. Valdez spoke for the first time. You've been talking to yourself in the field. Extended conversations, in fact, documented by our monitoring systems. You've been leaving objects in the forest, mirrors, notebooks, food items. You've been scratching messages into trees and rocks. She paused. Dr. Carter, these are not the actions of a scientist conducting field research. These are the actions of someone experiencing a psychological crisis. The trap was elegant. Everything I had done to communicate with the being could be reframed as evidence of mental illness. The symbols I had carved, the messages I had left, the hours spent in apparent solitude, all of it looked like delusion when stripped of context. I was conducting an experiment, I said carefully, testing wildlife response to novel objects and stimuli. Without approval, without documentation, without any peer review of your methodology? The administrator shook his head. Dr. Carter, you're a talented researcher, but you've violated multiple protocols. We're placing you on mandatory administrative leave effective immediately. You'll undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and based on those results, we'll determine whether you can return to field work or whether a reassignment is more appropriate. And if I refuse the evaluation, then we'll have no choice but to terminate your employment. I looked at Ms. Valdez. This is about what I saw, isn't it? About what you know I saw. Her expression didn't change. Dr. Carter, I have no idea what you're referring to. What I know is that you experienced an equipment theft, which must have been frustrating, and subsequently began displaying behavior consistent with work-related stress and possible dissociative episodes. That's all this is about, ensuring you get the help you need. The gaslighting was masterful. They couldn't acknowledge what I had found without validating its existence. They couldn't prosecute me without creating a public record. So they would simply dismantle my credibility, paint me as unstable, and remove me from the field under the guise of compassionate intervention. What happens to my research site? I asked. Your grid will be reassigned to another researcher, Dave said, finally speaking. His voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. Someone will maintain continuity on your projects. Someone who didn't know what was there. Someone who would collect data and see nothing unusual because they weren't looking for anything unusual. The beings would be safe through the simple expediency of my removal. I could fight this. I could go public, release whatever evidence I had managed to preserve. But what would that accomplish? At best, I would be dismissed as a disturbed individual seeking attention. At worst, I would trigger exactly the kind of scrutiny that would endanger the beings I was trying to protect. I'll take the leave, I said quietly. I'll do the evaluation. Relief was visible on Dave's face. The administrators nodded, already moving to the next item on their agenda. Only Ms. Valdez continued to watch me, her eyes assessing, calculating. As the meeting concluded, she approached me privately. Dr. Carter, may I speak with you for a moment? We stepped into an empty conference room. She closed the door and studied me for a long moment before speaking. You're a good person, she said finally. You saw something extraordinary and your instinct was to protect it, not exploit it. That's rare. She paused. But you need to understand the bigger picture. We're not the villains here. We're trying to manage an impossible situation, maintaining the safety of beings who would be destroyed by disclosure while also protecting public welfare. By erasing them from history? By letting them die out quietly? By giving them what they've chosen? Obscurity. We've been monitoring multiple populations around the world for decades. Some we've lost, discovered by loggers, hunters, developers. Those incidents always end the same way. Media circus, scientific exploitation, eventual capture or killing. The ones that survive are the ones that stay hidden. The ones we help stay hidden. They're dying anyway, I said. Their population is too small. She looked surprised that I knew this. Yes, we're aware. We've run the models. Within 2 to 3 generations, most isolated populations will no longer be viable. It's a tragedy, but it's not our tragedy to fix. Sometimes the most ethical choice is to do nothing, to let nature take its course without interference. That's convenient philosophy when it means you don't have to do anything difficult. And what would you have us do? Capture them for breeding programs? Relocate them against their will? Announce their existence and watch them become laboratory specimens or tourist attractions? She shook her head. You think you could have saved them, but you couldn't. No one can. We can only bear witness and try to minimize harm. Then let me bear witness, I said. Let me return to my work. I won't interfere. I won't report. I'll just be there. You're too emotionally compromised. You've proven that. The best thing you can do for them now is to walk away. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Dr. Carter. There are people in our organization who don't share my philosophical approach. People who believe that potential threats should be eliminated rather than managed. If you persist in trying to make contact, if you attract more attention to this situation, those people will become involved, and they won't be gentle. She left me sitting alone in the conference room, staring at my hands and understanding finally fully the impossible position I was in. I could not save them. I could not speak for them. I could not even stand beside them without endangering them further. The only gift I had left to offer was absence, to remove myself from their world and trust that silence was protection enough. It was the hardest surrender I had ever made. I took the psychiatric evaluation. I answered the questions carefully, honestly enough to seem genuine but strategic enough to avoid any diagnosis that would permanently damage my career. I spoke about stress, about the isolation of field work, about how the theft of my equipment had affected me more than I realized. I was cooperative, self-aware, willing to engage with therapy. The psychiatrist was kind, professional, and utterly convinced that I had experienced a stress-induced episode of mild paranoia and anthropomorphic projection. It's not uncommon in wilderness work, he said. The human mind needs patterns, needs social connection. In the absence of other humans, we sometimes create them from our surroundings. You saw what you needed to see: intelligence, companionship, in natural phenomena and wildlife behavior. I nodded and agreed and took the prescription for anti-anxiety medication I would never fill. The official assessment cleared me for return to duty with the recommendation of continued counseling and a temporary reassignment to work that involved more regular human contact. I was offered a position at the regional office coordinating data from multiple field sites. A promotion, technically. A cage, actually. I accepted it. And then I began planning my real work. For 2 months, I played the role of the recovered professional. I attended meetings, compiled reports, smiled at office gatherings, and showed every sign of being grateful for the intervention that had saved me from my own mental health crisis. I was patient, methodical, and very, very careful. During this time, I prepared my testimony, not for immediate release but for the future. I created multiple encrypted copies of every file I had managed to preserve: photographs, audio recordings, translations of the symbols, detailed accounts of every encounter. I wrote a comprehensive document explaining the Breckenridge Protocol, Ms. Valdez's visit, the governmental suppression of information, everything. I distributed these files through a network of dead drops, encrypted drives hidden in safe deposit boxes under false names, stored with lawyers who had instructions to release them only upon my death or disappearance, uploaded to multiple cloud services through anonymized accounts. If something happened to me, if I was silenced permanently, the truth would emerge eventually. It was my insurance policy, but more than that, it was my memorial. If the beings at Creekside Alpha were going to fade into extinction, at least there would be a record that they had existed, that they had been intelligent, beautiful, and worthy of more than we had given them. On October 3rd, I received my opportunity. A routine equipment inventory identified a need for someone to retrieve old camera units from several remote sites that were being decommissioned. The work would take approximately 1 week and required someone with experience in wilderness navigation. I volunteered immediately. The route included a site less than 3 miles from Creekside Alpha. I took my time with the official work, making sure to document every camera retrieval thoroughly, sending regular check-in messages via satellite communicator. I gave them no reason to doubt that I was doing exactly what I had been assigned to do. On October 7th, my last day in the field, I made a detour. I approached Creek Site Alpha differently this time, with the full knowledge that I might be observed, that this might be my last chance, and that any overt action could trigger consequences I couldn't control. I moved slowly, carefully, using terrain features to break up my silhouette, approaching from downwind. The creek was exactly as I remembered it. The same soft sound of water over stones, the same quality of light filtering through the canopy, the same sense of being at the edge of something profound. The spots where my cameras had been placed were empty now, though I could see faint traces of the blind I had built months ago. I didn't set up equipment. I didn't leave obvious messages. I simply sat on a fallen log near the water and waited. For 3 hours, nothing happened. The forest went about its business. Ravens called overhead. A Douglas squirrel chattered from a nearby tree. The creek continued its endless conversation with the stones. I began to think that they were gone, that the population had moved on, or had already declined past the point of visibility. Then, as the light began to fade toward evening, I felt it, that sense of being observed, the weight of attention from an intelligence that was neither hostile nor welcoming, but profoundly curious. I didn't turn around. I didn't search the tree line. I simply spoke softly, knowing that if they were there, they would hear. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry for the intrusion, for the cameras, for bringing attention to this place. I'm sorry that I couldn't help. I'm sorry that I can't stay." I paused, gathering my thoughts. "I want you to know that I see you, not just with my eyes, but with understanding. You are not alone in being aware. You are not insignificant. Your existence matters." The forest listened. I continued. "I've documented everything I learned, not to expose you, never that, but so that someday, if humans grow wise enough, if we become what we should be instead of what we are, someone will know you were here. Someone will know that Earth was enriched by more than one kind of consciousness." I reached into my pack and pulled out a small object I had spent weeks creating, a stone carved with symbols, theirs and mine interwoven, a hybrid language that represented the bridge we had built across impossible distances. I placed it carefully on the log beside me. "This is for you, all of you, if there are more." It says, I struggled with translation. It says, "Two minds met in the forest. They could not save each other, but they saw each other truly." That seeing was enough. I stood slowly, shouldered my pack, and began walking away. I did not look back. Looking back would have been selfish, an attempt to get one more glimpse, one more moment of confirmation. I had said what I came to say. The rest was up to them. I had walked perhaps 50 yards when I heard it, a soft sequence of clicks and whistles, the same harmonic pattern I had recorded months ago. It came from somewhere behind me, multiple sources creating an overlapping chorus. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence, not empty, but full, acknowledged, shared. I did not look back. I continued walking until I reached my truck, drove to the regional office, submitted my final report on the equipment retrieval, and resigned from the Forest Service effective the end of the month. My supervisor was surprised but supportive. "What will you do?" Dave asked. "I'm not sure yet," I told him. "Maybe teach, maybe write, maybe just remember." He nodded, not understanding but trying to. "You'll be missed, Carter." "Thank you," I said, "for everything." What I didn't say was, "Thank you for employing me when I stumbled onto the most important discovery in human history. Thank you for not asking too many questions. Thank you for being decent when decent was harder than ruthless." That was 6 months ago. I live now in a small cabin in Montana, technically writing a book on wilderness ecology, but actually doing something much more important. I'm teaching myself to be still, to exist without the need to document, to catalog, to preserve, to simply be present with the knowledge I carry. The psychiatric evaluation labeled me as someone who had experienced a temporary crisis, brought on by isolation. The official record says I saw patterns that weren't there, projected human qualities onto wildlife, and required intervention to return to rational thinking. That's the story that exists in databases, in personnel files, in the careful bureaucratic language that erases inconvenient truths. Let them believe that. The truth is safely hidden, distributed across multiple secure locations. waiting for a future that may never come. If humanity destroys itself through climate catastrophe or nuclear war, if our civilization collapses and something else rises from the ruins, perhaps then my documentation will be found. Perhaps then it will matter. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the beings at Creekside Alpha will fade into extinction exactly as the models predict, leaving nothing but ambiguous footprints and a scatter of carved stones that will baffle archaeologists. Perhaps I will die having never spoken publicly about what I witnessed, and my knowledge will die with me despite my careful preparations. I find I'm at peace with that uncertainty. What I learned in that forest goes beyond the existence of non-human intelligence. I learned that some knowledge is a burden, that truth can be a weapon, and that sometimes the most profound discoveries are the ones we choose not to share. I learned that witness is its own form of action, that seeing, truly seeing, carries moral weight even when it cannot carry outcomes. The encrypted files exist as insurance, yes, but also as something else, proof that I was worthy of what I witnessed. The beings at Creekside Alpha trusted me with their existence, however briefly, however incompletely. They showed themselves to someone who might have destroyed them, and they did so because they recognized something. Curiosity, yes, but also restraint, respect. I try to live up to that recognition. I don't search for more populations. I don't investigate reports of sightings or attempt to contact other researchers who might have had similar experiences. I have removed myself from the equation deliberately, consciously, knowing that my involvement brings danger no matter how careful I am. But I watch the news. I monitor scientific journals. I pay attention to patterns, unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas, reports of unusual phenomena that are quickly dismissed, occasional references in obscure publications to management protocols and containment strategies that could mean anything or could mean everything. The Breckenridge Protocol is real. I'm certain of that now. It operates in the shadows of multiple agencies with funding that doesn't appear in public budgets and authority that flows from classified directives. It's not conspiracy in the paranoid sense. It's pragmatic governance of an impossible situation. They're not evil. They're just making the calculation that disclosure would cause more harm than suppression. They might even be right. I honestly don't know anymore. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the question the stones posed. Are we the last? I think about how many remote places still exist on Earth, how many deep forests, mountain ranges, cave systems, underwater trenches, areas so hostile to human presence that we've barely touched them. Is it possible that other populations exist, equally hidden, equally fragile, equally alone? The optimist in me wants to believe they're out there, that the beings at Creekside Alpha are part of a larger diaspora, scattered but surviving, maintaining the silence that has protected them for generations, that someday, if we're very lucky and very wise, we might earn the privilege of knowing them. The realist in me knows that even if they exist, contact would likely be fatal, that the safest thing for any non-human intelligence on this planet is to remain hidden from us until we've evolved past our current capacity for destruction and exploitation. That might take centuries. It might never happen. I received one more communication, though I can't prove it wasn't my imagination or coincidence. 3 months ago, I was hiking in the Beartooth Mountains, miles from any trail, when I found a stone carefully placed on a flat boulder. It was carved with a single symbol, one I recognized from the stones at Creekside Alpha. The symbol that meant, approximately, remembering. I sat with that stone for a long time, turning it over in my hands, feeling the precision of the carving. Then I placed it back exactly where I found it and walked away. If it was a message, the message was, we remember too. You were not insignificant. The bridge you tried to build mattered, even though it couldn't hold the weight you wanted it to carry. Or maybe it was just a rock with erosion patterns that happened to look like symbols carved by a being that might or might not exist. Maybe my mind is still making patterns where none exist, seeing what it needs to see in the random chaos of nature. I don't know which interpretation is true. I've stopped trying to know. These days, I'm learning to exist with uncertainty, to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously without collapsing them into false certainty. It's harder than it sounds. We're trained to seek answers, to resolve ambiguity, to know. But some things resist knowing. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. And sometimes the most profound truth is simply this. I saw something extraordinary. I was changed by it. And I chose to honor it through silence rather than proclamation. If you're reading this, if somehow my testimony has been released, then something has happened to me. Or perhaps enough time has passed that disclosure no longer carries the same risks. Or perhaps you're an archivist in some distant future, trying to understand the early 21st century through the scattered remains of its suppressed knowledge. Whatever the case, know this: we were not alone. We are not alone. Intelligence takes many forms, and consciousness is not the exclusive property of humanity. What we do with that knowledge, how we respond to the discovery of other minds, will define what kind of species we are. I hope you choose better than we did. I hope you choose witness over exploitation, protection over exposure, coexistence over domination. There are still places where the world resists our understanding. There are still silences that speak louder than our noise. There are still beings who exist at the edges of our awareness, hoping that we will pass by without seeing, without destroying, without claiming ownership of everything we touch. The greatest act of respect is sometimes to look away, to grant privacy to what asks for nothing but to be left alone, to understand that not every secret is meant to be solved, not every mystery is meant to be explained, not every existence is meant to be documented. I learned that lesson too late to help the beings at Creekside Alpha, but I learned it nonetheless, and now I offer it to you. Some discoveries are not conquests. Some knowledge is not power. Some truths are sacred precisely because they remain unspoken. Let the forests keep their secrets. Let the silence be enough. And if you ever find yourself at the edge of something extraordinary, something that could change everything or destroy everything, have the courage to simply witness it, honor it, and walk away. That's the real test of wisdom, knowing when not to know, when not to speak, when not to act. I failed that test in many ways, but in the end, I passed the only one that mattered. I chose their survival over my ambition. I chose their silence over my voice. And that, I think, is enough.